What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for YouTube. As some people are surely aware, the channel just hit 100,000 subscribers, which means after 7 years I've finally done all of the things. Some people will tell you that there are channels with 100+ million subscribers, but I believe that to just be a myth, as my goal has been 100,000 for so long that I can only assume it is the absolute pinnacle of achievement on this platform, and I will accept no other answers. But as I mentioned, I've been playing this YouTube game for quite some time. It's a pretty time-consuming endeavor. It took me 7 years to reach this point, so needless to say, I'm feeling pretty great about it. But as we jump into this, let's talk about what YouTube actually is, because it's probably the strangest game I've ever played. At its core, it's a sort of bizarre management sim, where you use analytics and metrics to maximize viewership of a topic you are particularly passionate about. And if you do that well enough, Google will pay you cold hard cash for it, which puts you in an interesting position when you review video games, because most games do not actually reward you with real-world currency, and given that I can make videos about a particular game, I can effectively turn every game that I play into a money-making machine. And as everyone knows, playing games for a living from the comfort of your own house is about as good as it gets, which is why success in this title is so highly sought after. Now, some people tell me that you can use YouTube for things besides video games, but I'm not convinced. And now that I'm famous for achieving 100,000 subscribers, the fame has unfortunately went straight to my head, and everyone else's opinions on the subject is irrelevant. YouTube is only for video games. I will hear no arguments to the contrary. But with those things said, let's actually dive into the story setup of this particular title. But you see, the truly interesting thing about YouTube as a game is that it has a ton of choice and consequence, which leads to a lot of emergent storytelling. So while I can give you my story setup, chances are if you attempt to play this title yourself, you will in fact have your own story to play and see through, which is perhaps the most unique thing about the game. But personally, my story for this game started 7 years ago, on the night of Halloween in 2015. I was working a job I didn't care for, basically 60 to 70 hours a week, and I decided I needed to find a way to relax, and my chosen method was to start a hobby. That hobby turned out to be making YouTube videos, because I had been watching a lot of YouTube content creators myself and decided I could probably do that, and then I proceeded to do it very badly for the span of 5 years. Because much like a hardcore RPG, at the beginning, your stats are terrible, you don't really have any idea what the controls are or what you're doing, and you have to figure all of that stuff out first. Now for me, the very first video I ever uploaded actually was a small video for World of Warcraft of all things. It was where to find a specific Murloc pet that had just been added to the game. And while I knew I wanted to make videos, I didn't really know what I wanted to make them about. Fallout 4 had just recently launched at the time, or was about to launch, I don't remember exactly. So I started covering that a little bit for the channel, and believe it or not, my very first review I ever did was for Fallout 4, and it is terrible. Please don't go look at it. But from there and at that time, I was actually playing a lot of MMOs, so what I would cover was things like Elder Scrolls Online a good bit, and while I actually do to this day enjoy Elder Scrolls Online quite a bit, despite not really playing it anymore because I no longer have time for MMOs, as YouTube has consumed all of my free time to create more content in the ever-consuming fires of the content quest. But nonetheless, I covered a lot of MMOs for a little while, and then doing that a little bit on and off here and there, kind of not really knowing what I wanted to do with the channel but still making videos, a game called Divinity Original Sin 2 came out. You might have heard about it. And that game sort of reignited my love for CRPGs, which I had played a decent bit of, but not in quite some time, honestly. And I started making videos for that. And while my previous MMO videos had started to do a little well, and I had learned a little more about structuring videos and making them and editing, I still wasn't really quite there. And while I'm proud of my early Divinity Original Sin 2 videos simply because they were a pretty big milestone to getting me here, they still weren't exactly my best work, as I was still figuring out the best way to present myself and the information in a video. But I was truly taken with Divinity. I had actually not played any of the other Divinity games, and what I decided to do, because I loved Original Sin 2 so much, was play through all of the other Divinity games, making story series and lore for the Divinity universe, which is kind of where my channel started to find its feet a little bit, as I noticed that all of my content for CRPGs did very, very well, especially Divinity. So I started making all sorts of lore videos for it, which was of course a pretty good time, and then from there I started to branch out to covering reviewing other types of CRPGs, making build videos for them, just talking about them generally, that kind of thing. But at the time, I was doing all of this while still having a regular job. But then, of course, the beginning of 2020 rolls around. And as we all know, that was the start of the pandemic. By this point, I was actually doing pretty well at work. I was on salary, actually, making pretty good money. I had already bought my house at this point. But at the start of 2020, things kind of started to fall apart a little bit. As myself and my son's mother had split up, I was working this job I hated. There was this pandemic kicking off, of course. And ultimately, I just decided it was time for a change. So I stepped back from my salaried position to a full-time, just regular hourly job. So I was only working like 40 hours a week instead of like 60 plus that I had been working years up to that point. Now, this was primarily to honestly spend more time with my son, given the situation, of course. But the side effect of this was I also had more time to dedicate to YouTube, which meant that I was working less hours overall, spending more time with my son, and playing more games, which of course allowed me to cover more video games. And this went on. I was still covering Divinity lore and everything at the time, and I was doing fairly well. The channel started to pick up a little bit of traction, a couple thousand subscribers, that kind of thing. And that went on for about a year until the start of 2021, which is when I started to really get into Pathfinder CRPGs specifically. I was a little bit familiar with the rule set at the time, honestly much more so now, but I was familiar enough with it, and I started playing those CRPGs in anticipation of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. And that game had just hit beta, actually, at this, I believe it was February of 2021, and no one was really covering it. It was this big, deep CRPG, and you just couldn't find any videos on it. And then I started covering it, and those videos just started blowing up. Easily my most watched stuff up to that point. So I started covering the game very, very extensively, and the channel started taking off from there. And by the time the game launched, later that year in September, I was able to step into YouTube full time as it had outpaced the money I was making elsewhere. And I ended 2021 with about 35,000 subscribers. And of course, at this point, I had really kind of stepped into reviewing games fully. At the start of 2021, end of 2020, I had started like actually reviewing games properly, as I had started covering so many types of CRPGs that people were asking for my opinions on some of them. So I started making the reviews. And while I was covering Wrath of the Righteous pretty extensively, I also started reviewing other games at the same time. So after Wrath of the Righteous had released and I had still, continued to cover it, the reviews were also starting to blow up. And given that, Wrath was out now, I started putting more attention into the reviews, making them better. And given my approach of doing them after 100%, people really took a liking to that. And how I provided links to my Steam profile and everything, people seemed very appreciative of it, because as I'm sure many people watching this are aware, the integrity of most reviewers these days is questionable. I think in today's day and age, you really need to, as a reviewer, provide your audience and the people consuming those reviews a reason to take you seriously, which is what I think the reviews after 100% did more than anything else. But more on that in just a little bit, because now I want to talk about the progression systems for YouTube. Much like the game itself, they encompass both real-life aspects as well as more intangible things. Because as I mentioned, a big part of this title is honestly just maximizing your views. So how do we do that? Well, that's a little tricky because it comes down to a lot of different things. For starters, there's the quality of the video itself, which can include physical equipment, not to mention your own skills at editing software, especially when you're starting out. You're not going to be able to afford an editor. I choose not to hire a freelance one at this point, simply because I would rather edit the videos myself and keep them on a more personal level, though I could realistically hire a freelancer to edit for me if I really wanted to. But obviously, the content of the video is just as important, down to the things you're talking about, how you're presenting this information. Are you talking about a subject that is relatively searchable? Do you know how people are finding your video? Does your account have consistent branding? If someone looks at a thumbnail, do they immediately know that it's from you? What's your style? What's your approach? Is it consistent? All of which are factors that YouTube has analytics you can easily look up. But my personal challenges with this were a little bit down to equipment, and then I think a lot of it comes down to learning how to present yourself, and even once you get that figured out, understanding the best way to edit yourself. And it's one of those things where there's just so many different little factors, and there's not even necessarily one right way to do it. But ultimately, you keep experimenting, you keep changing little things here and there until you find what works for you, and then kind of locking onto that and experimenting more, seeing if you can get more out of it. As the people who have been with the channel a long time will know, I've gone through many iterations of the things that I do. And one thing that I think helps greatly with this in particular, actually, is that I put out daily videos. When you put out daily videos, the individual success of each video really isn't as important as if you were only putting out one video a month. Because I do daily videos, every single video I put out is a chance to experiment and try something if I want it to be. And if it fails, oh well, then I'm on to the next thing tomorrow. But that's how I've personally done it. Let's talk about the combat of this game. And by combat, I mean fighting for views. Now, I'm sure many people who are on this platform regularly are well aware of some of the tactics people use to get you to click on their video and watch. Obviously, there's all sorts of clickbait tactics with some outrageous title that usually poses some sort of question that winds up being irrelevant to the video itself, and honestly just setting up your video in a way that makes it more searchable, as I like to think of it, as there are some videos I make and I know they're not going to do particularly well because there's no real way for people to just find them organically because the subject is too niche. And in those cases, sometimes this can be offset a little bit by having a bigger audience, because if the subject isn't necessarily searchable on its own, if you have enough people click on it from your subscriber base, YouTube will eventually be like, oh, maybe other people would like to see this outside of these normal circles and start pushing it farther out. So it's not completely hopeless if you have a niche video like that, but generally speaking, they do just worse overall than, say, something that's easy to search like a review. Now, my personal approach to this has been somewhat twofold. I try to avoid clickbait as much as humanly possible. To some degree, I think there's always some element of it present because that's just, the way this platform works. And that's honestly what led me to the reviews after 100%, because a lot of people often mention to me that, hey, you probably don't need to do these 100%. The reviews would likely be relatively the same, even if you only did like 80%. And while I don't totally disagree, I think those statements somewhat miss the bigger point of the review after 100%. When you see something that has that title, it is immediately more intriguing to someone than just another review. Because if you see another title that's just like, this game review, here's how I felt about it for a title, versus a guy who's just plainly stating, here's this game, I did all of it, I found that that's somewhat compelling for a lot of people, which leads them to click on it. Just stating that is one thing, but backing it up is another, which is why I've always tried to link my Steam profile and everything in the description, keep that public, and provide what proof I can, if you will, which also builds a sort of sense of integrity on my part, because I'm not just saying it, the review reflects that I've covered all these things, and then also you can check out the Steam profile if you want. That builds a certain level of trust that I've actually engaged with this game to the full extent, as opposed to, again, the perception of other reviewers having not done so, regardless of whether or not it's true. And this, I think, has been kind of a key driver of my success, leveraging the unique way I tend to do something, because I was playing games like this long before I was reviewing them this way. I don't feel like I've gotten my money's worth out of a game until I've done essentially what I would do for a review. And leveraging that sort of unique approach that most people tend to burn out on, that I've been doing basically forever, just at a lesser scale. And finding a way to sort of market that, if you want to put it that way, since I have a sales background, has been, I think, the key driver. Now, the nice thing about it, though, at the same time, is that's not even all I do. I do obviously do mainly reviews at this point, but I still do a lot of guides, list videos, discussion type stuff. At the end of the day, I'm just incredibly passionate about video games, as they've helped me through many a tough moment in my life, which I've talked about somewhat recently, so I won't rehash it here. But if I had to boil it down to anything, it would be finding a way to leverage something unique about your approach in a way that makes it more marketable, if you will, which is pretty much my approach to getting as many views as I can, which of course is what enables me to continue doing this for a living. Now let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. Now the positives of the YouTube game are very obviously working from home, getting to spend time with your family. I get to play video games with my son somewhat regularly, provided the game isn't too outrageous, as he's still pretty little. And another big positive is that I get to share those experiences with, of course, the people around me, but moreover, the community at large. I get to share my opinions about things. I often get games early for review copies at this point, and I get to share opinions about them with the community and have those conversations that in my private life I was never really able to get. And that was part of the reason I was left feeling so unfulfilled in my job, is because I just wasn't passionate about it. Whereas this, I am passionate about it and I get to talk with thousands of people about it, and it means the world to me. That's a huge positive. But like any job, are there negatives? Yeah, absolutely. Though I think when it comes to talking about negatives for this particular kind of work, I think it can be a little bit silly because there is nothing else I would rather do. Every bad part of this job is easily ignored for how incredibly blessed I am for being able to get to do it. So while there are negatives, they're easily ignored for me. But if I had to point anything out, I would say there's something to be said about turning your passion into work, though I'm honestly the kind of guy who's more on the do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life side of the fence, as this does not feel like work to me. And beyond that, you kind of run into some weird little problems when you do this for a living. For instance, I pretty much have to find a way to get up and move for like 30 to 45 minutes a day just to get some exercise in, because otherwise I'm just sitting 24/7, which as we all know is obviously not healthy. So there's a lot of health risks associated with this if you're not taking measures to counter it, which is true of any job where you're relatively sedentary. And also because you're working from home, you do kind of have to go out of your way to achieve any amount of social interaction, really, as I don't really leave the house much, as you might imagine. But that brings us to our conclusion. And that is that making content on YouTube isn't exactly for everyone. I would say some people are probably better off just doing it as a hobby, as something they enjoy every once in a while, because the amount of work it takes to be successful on this platform can be at the detriment of other aspects of your life at times. Meaning that if you really want to do this, you have to really want to do this. It's got to be the work you wake up thinking about. It's got to be the thing you're most passionate about. It's got to be the subject you want to talk about nonstop, because that's sort of the energy you have to bring to it. And provided you're okay with that, then I think it can potentially be the best job there is, because for me, that's what it is. This is the best job I've ever had, likely ever will have. And it's incredible. I love it. But at the same time, it's an incredible amount of work. I spent 5 years on this platform making basically zero money. And if I had quit anywhere in that 5 years, I never would have gotten to this successful point. So a lot of the potential positives for YouTube are a lot of you seeing how many times you can roll that dice, knowing full well you might not ever get anything out of it. And because of that, you really have to love this work and commit yourself to it, to the point where even if I wasn't making money, I'd still be making these videos because it's just what I want to do. And it's what I did do for 5 years before I got to a successful point where I actually started turning a profit. And while I would, again, frankly be doing this regardless of the situation, I am nonetheless incredibly grateful for everyone who has subscribed and joined me on this journey, as sappy as that may sound. But the fact that anybody wants to listen to me talk about video games all day, every day, is still mind-blowing to me. I appreciate that people trust my opinions on these things, that they want to hear more, that they suggest games that I can talk about, and it's just an amazing community to be a part of, and for that I could not be more grateful. Now, I was considering doing a QA portion for this, but honestly, just leave your questions in the comments below. I will read them and answer them where applicable. But with all that said, while I have 100% YouTube at this point, definitively I will be taking no questions on the matter. I nonetheless plan to continue playing. I hope to grow the channel even farther, as it's been an incredible ride thus far, and I cannot thank everyone enough for giving me the opportunity to do this. As without you watching, the channel would look quite different. So truly, thank all of you for liking, commenting, subscribing on all the videos that got us to this point. It means the world to me. Truly. Thank you guys. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.